Om Satyena Labhistapasa Hyesa Atma Samyagyanena Brahmacharyena Nityam Antaha Sharirehi Jyotirmayo Hi Shubhraha Yam Pashanti Yataya Kshinadoshaha Om Shantihi Shantihi Shantihi. The Atman, the indivisible self in all beings and all things, is realized by knowledge. By moderation, by austerities, and by veracity. All of these constantly cultivated. When mental impurities dissolve due to this practice, then the seer beholds it everywhere, existing in everything, even here in this very life, mind, and body. Om, peace, peace, peace. Om Sahana Vavatu, Sahana Bhunaktu, Sahaviryam Karvavahai, Tejasvinavaditamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. May Brahman, divine reality, protect us. May Brahman sustain us, and may Brahman illumine our thinking process. May we not find fault with each other, with the world, or with the teachings. And may what we study be a source of inspiration to us eternally. Om, peace, peace, peace. Peace be unto us and peace be unto all. Om Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om Tat Sat. We all gather here as an SRV Sangha, and any new friends looking on into our Sunday event of Jnana Yoga practices, one of the main things that Swami Vivekananda brought to us, so that our lives would be attended with more than just meditation, which was also quite new to us back in the 50s and 60s. And more than even just some once a week worship that was going on at the time too, but that we'd have something profound and somewhere to look to within us that would satisfy our wants and our needs for all time, as Vivekananda has said. Because the lower knowledge hasn't been doing that for us. And as Krishna says in the Gita, knowledge that doesn't find its way to truth is a dangerous proposition. So interesting to look at in terms of our Western scientific knowledge, the good it's produced for us, the pleasures that it has brought to hand for us, and also the dangers and risks and downside of scientific advancement, if you want to call it that. So cause and effect is at work, is what we say. If you walking around and you drop something, then you could be pretty sure that gravity is working. And it's the same if you live a life, as I just chanted, in life, mind, and body, where this Atman is the backdrop, but you don't know it's the backdrop, then you're very soon going to become aware that there's karma to pay, or there's cause and effect going on all the time. Any act will have a reaction. Or as Holy Mother would put it, you have to pay for the use of this body and this world to the very last farthing. A farthing is a very tiny increment, but I think she didn't use annum or rupee when she said that, but she, at least it was interpreted that she knew about the English currency in its tiniest form. So to the last farthing we have to pay for the use of these things with cause and effect. The person who finds that out and is able to raise a defense against karma, that is, give up the demerit called papa in Buddhism and take to the meritorious path called punya, then that person makes some swift spiritual progress and begins to get beyond such things which we don't have words for in English, like gunas, karma, and samskaras. If you say these words in circles that have the influence of Eastern religion on them, particularly Far Eastern, India, Buddhism, Jainism, Hinduism, Vedanta, which we are a part of that great fold thanks to Swami Vivekananda bringing that great darshana here to us, then you'll find out that there is some defense or some refuge that you can be taking against the vagaries and vicissitudes of Maya, one of my favorite sayings. Maya meaning this name, form, time, space element or quotient that we're all facing off against day by day. And some of us sensitize ourselves to it, some of us desensitize ourselves to it, some of us become callous to it, some of us try and brush it under the rug and pretend it's not there. Others try and face it off with sadhana and fail. Some then try and face it off with sadhana or spiritual practice and begin to make headway towards the goal of human existence, which is moksha. I'm about ready to talk about that a little bit, because the title of this class today, and I must announce here that it probably will be a 3-class series rather than a 2-class series. We'll have 2 classes on it, this Sunday and next Sunday. They're now hour-and-a-half classes, as you know. So people with their busy lives can maybe see it from beginning to end. But then there'll be a seminar weekend, and in that seminar weekend I'm going to be talking about how a householder renounces. I stuttered when I said that. That's how terrifying that word is to most householders. How a householder renounces. Can we do that? And if we do it, will it really make our lives much better? As some of us has found, the attachments go away and detachment comes more to the fore, and we feel more balanced and at peace. Especially if we renounce those things first that are not needful, unworthy of us, and things that are unnecessary, that maybe shouldn't have been there in the picture in the first place, that we inherited from upbringing and parentage, because they didn't get the Dharma either back there in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, in the 50s in which I was born. In fact, 1950 I was born. So when I came on the scene, this little old me, and things like Zen Buddhism, and then Tibetan Buddhism, and then Sufism, and then finally Vedanta was the underground river to it all, I thought. And we started reading the Gita back in the 60s and 70s. The Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna made its way into our hands. The most marvelous manuscript of this particular time, with this great Kali avatar at the base of it, Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. And then we found out that spiritual practice was a great refuge. So that's what I'm going on and on about here, by way of also announcing the title to this 3-class series, The Will to Live a Spiritual Life. And it really was corroborated for me, I think early on, the way I understood it, when I went around the homes of my students and visited the devotees, whether it was in India or whether it was here in America or in Europe. And one of the things I always saw that had gone missing was a daily spiritual practice. Not to be too critical, there were spiritual observances going on. Maybe you did a little worship at the altar, and did your hours meditation in the morning, and perhaps read something from one of the great scriptures of the world. But as Vivekananda said when he came here, they'll take a little of this Dharma, a little bit of this Jnanam, but they don't like large amounts. That's a direct quote from him. But as I've often reported when I went to visit the monks in India in the Ramakrishna order and a few other orders too, is that when they showed me their life, because I got close to them, it was filled with sadhana from sun up to sundown, and it also included work. At the bookstall, selling books on divine wisdom, or going from center to center, giving talks, cleaning up the altar after pujas, picking fresh flowers, serving in that way. They were doing all the things that we do with a very intense work life, but they had this spiritual life in every other moment. There wasn't a free moment, like, oh, I think I'll take some time off for myself. Really, there is no self, so you can't take time off for it, but that's going in a different direction. I won't start down the Advaitic way yet. But the will to live a spiritual life came to me in the form of seeing that from my own experience, that people were having a little practice. Later on, our founder, Lexicon, was to coin that phrase, mundane spiritual convention, I think is the word I'm looking for.
Mundane human convention.
Yeah, mundane convention. So this was these religions that were going on, that was a religious practice that were just conventionally in nature. So that phrase came to be, then later on I heard Buddha speaking in the Dhammapada about how rust of households was the lack of spiritual practice, and rust of monasteries was the lack of recitation of scriptures. So he saw that in his time, which is maybe 550 years previous to Christ. And then Shankara's Vivekachudamani, reading that a few times in my early life, I came across this eightfold strata of spiritual advancement, which you'll see here on this main chart, which I've titled The Will to Live a Spiritual Life. And we'll take this as a main chart over the next 3 classes that we give on these Sundays, with that seminar Sunday weekend being more on how a householder renounces. So these 2 topics work very well together. And we get to go to a deeper level of what renunciation is, maybe to prepare you for it so it won't be a shock. And this was said to me by several monks that I knew, that renunciation is not condemnation, it's deification. So we'll be talking about the art of deification that a householder can practice, how they have to look upon their children as God, and their wives and husbands as God, food as God. I mean, we've been studying this all along anyway, and in SRV for some 30 years now, how to divinize everyday life. There are books put on about spiritualizing everyday life. Some titles are coming into my head now, mainly from the Ramakrishna order and from this very unique set of monks by the hundreds that Vivekananda birthed as his own children. They were his mind-born children by the hundreds and now thousands. Never seen anything like that happen in the world. And those beings are all over the world now, in centers everywhere, holding this banner of Vedanta that Shankara first held up in 700 AD at the close of a Buddhistic era. All dharmas come to a close in time, and then they have a fresh start after a while. So that's not a matter of inferior and superior. It's a matter of constant flux and change that everything's going through, even religion. So mention of those 3 or 4 things that came to me, then I was asked by the Ramakrishna order recently, Advaita Ashrama Arm, to write an article for Prabhupada Bharata. This is the 3rd article I've contributed over some, 40 years. And so they come back to me every once in a while and say, "Sir," they say, Or sometimes they'll write you and say, Divine Atman, would you write an article for our next edition, our next journal? So Prabhupada Bharata, Awakened India, is a beautiful journal that's started by Swami Vivekananda when he was alive in the 1800s and early 1900s, and many issues have come out monthly of it. So when they asked me to write that, I thought about this potential problem, or this understatement, this lack of the will to live a spiritual life in terms of the Viveka Chudamani, the crest jewel of discrimination, and went to those slokas in Shankara's scripture and culled that out, eightfold strata, and then all the various things that I could think about that could contribute to success in one's attempt to bring forth a sadhana into one's daily life, to clarify and intensify, as we were saying yesterday at satsang. So you can read that article, Will to Live a Spiritual Life, here in the Prabhupada Bharata issue of last month, and get an idea of where I'm coming from on this particular subject. But short of just a few pages, then I decided we would put it on as a class series. In that we look at it very deeply so that it could help us intensify our spiritual life. And because that was one of the things our founder, Lex Hickson, was always on and on about. He wanted us to intensify our spiritual life. We used to even call each other on the phone, him in New York and myself in Hawaii. Let's meet at Swami Sheshanandaji Maharaj's in Portland for Durga Puja or for Swamiji's birthday or whatever, and let's intensify our spiritual life. And so that was one of the words that he liked very much, as if resting on one's laurels or just being satisfied with one's daily practice for an hour, and maybe only one yoga instead of 4. Because we know besides the karma yoga that we're doing all the time, and many people's acts aren't really done as conscious karma yoga, but if you do selfless service, if your work is considered a selfless service to God existing in mankind, then you're serving God all the time, then that's a valid yoga, and you can make some substantial spiritual progress in that. But to add in the yogas of devotion, intensify them, to add in the yoga of meditation, and I think, or I know, I should say, that if you add in the Jnana Yoga prior to meditation, if you're doing your memorization of slokas, and if you're reading the scriptures of India, doing your svadhyaya, as the father of yoga says, then the meditations are going to be quite naturally elevated. I would say that if that's not there, you may have a chance of jumping steps, starting off right out of your dreaming state in the morning with everything that went by, your mind not very elevated, and just trying to meditate and then reach a high position in that meditation, and maybe failing most times out of the 30 meditations per month, or the 365 meditations per year, Holy Mother used to say. You have to keep them up constantly and consciously, she said, because if you don't keep them up every day, you'll miss those ones that were almost predestined to arrive at your doorstep, particularly if you're doing sadhana around them. So, to ensure then that your meditations will be higher, more elevated, and maybe even carry you beyond something like the 4 fruits of life, or the 3 fruits of life, into moksha, or liberation, would be ensured by taking up this 4th yoga called jnanam, and then going into meditation. So, of course, SRV is known, if it's known for anything, for proposing that we expand our minds in their ability to know Brahman. That's right out of the peace chants. Apyayantu mamangani vak pranaschakshu shrotamata balmindriyani cha sarvani sarvam brahma upanishadam. Let's read about Brahman in the Upanishads and therefore expand our mind's ability to know Brahman and to know that we are that Brahman when push comes to shove. That means when you and your ego get in a fight one day and try and push each other out of the mind. And who will win? Most often the ego wins that battle. But if the divine self can be installed in the shrine of the heart, then the ego will have to ripen in the mind or it'll have to move on. And that's what we hope to have happen, and more likely which will happen if you put these great teachings of the Upanishads in your mind and hold them there like a torch, like an eternal flame. And so the mind is thinking of nothing but thoughts of Brahman all the time. It's one of the great secrets of Shankara and others. It's just to hold the mind in Brahman all the time. It's not that hard to do. Might be hard, maybe, say, to memorize a lot. Maybe that's not everyone's cup of Darjeeling tea, one of the best teas in the world. But there are easier ways to accomplish things like that, and that's just to train your mind to concentrate. Call it one-pointedness if you want, or call it the sixth limb of yoga, dharana, concentration if you like. Fixedness of mind, at least not scattered mind, or indeterminate mind, which is wavering all the time. Yatta dipo nivatastu nengati sopama smrita yogino yata chisasya yunjato yogam atmanaha. The Atman comes to that one, reveals itself to that one who's steeped in yoga, whose mind is like a candle in a windless place. So the winds of Maya, samsara always blowing through, the currents of the ocean of samsara always taking the sailing ship of the mind, bounding mind mechanism away, Krishna tells Arjuna on the battlefield, blown away by those kinds of things. How do I remain steady in that? So it's a practice that will be shored up if you can focus your mind one-pointed on these great profound words, because inside of words there's great Shakti power, not just the surface meaning that in the West we've learned through our educational process in order to make us money or get us popular or make us successful or give us more pleasure, all to come to naught in the end. When we look at that seminar on renunciation in 2 weekends from now, we'll look at some of Bhartrihari's verses on renunciation. The Shatakam, he wrote 3 of them. One of them is on the power of renunciation. He has some very powerful things to say about that and how he attained it. So keeping that mind focused from that problem of iron filings just being scattered because no magnet ever came into our life. We had a great magnet of Sri Ramakrishna come into your life and you were a bhakta, then that was good for you. If you had a great magnet like Swami Vivekananda come into your life and you were interested in Jnanam, then the iron filings of your intelligence would rush towards that magnet and adhere to it and not let go ever. If you had a great love for Divine Mother and Sri Sharada Devi came into your life, as I've seen happen just in the last few weeks with a couple of my young students who have freshly come to the SRV, are weeping sometimes for a vision of Divine Mother. They'll weep when they hear words about her. So these words are very powerful, and we need to use them to increase our will to live a spiritual life. Because that can come and go. It can wax and wane, just like the moon. And we want to keep it intense at all times. That was, or is, the secret of great souls. And what I saw in our founder, Lexixian, for instance, peace and bliss be upon him. So the will to live a spiritual life has been announced by my usual preamble at this first class. And we want to take up this chart, which you'll now see in front of you on your screen. And you can see that if you have come to the book, know about the book Footfalls of the Indian Rishis, which we've put out within the past months on SRV. I think all my students have copies of it already, and it's voluminous and weighty, and it has some 300 charts in it. And one of those books will be graced by this cover. You can see somebody has made their way to the top of that peak. They have an intense will to live a spiritual life, and they've left footprints in the snow on their sojourn, their pilgrimage to get to the summit. And you can see there that the eightfold strata of spiritual practice or attainment has been placed on the left-hand side of the chart. And I put it across the board with Patanjali's 8 limbs, which is yogic practice. We talk about Vedantic realization and yogic practice. That's how Vedanta and yoga come together as one of these wonderful hybrids, if you could even call it that. They're almost natural to one another. Their soil is indigenous to one another, the soil of each of them. But you can see there, as we get started, that the 8 strata of spiritual attainment that's mentioned in the Victories starts off with a human birth. Manushyattvam, they call that in Sanskrit. So across the board there, I compared that with 5 yamas and niyamas of yoga. So that's where we'll begin our journey here. When we talk about a human birth, I don't know, I think maybe we'll just start into it and then move up strata by strata. Just as long as you understand that these are the 8 strata of spiritual attainment that Shankara explains to us in a few slokas. So he wants you to have a human birth, I'll just say it out, then strength of body, and then fundamental purity of mind, and then you get to the ability to live a spiritual life. Then it will stick. By speaking about snow there, snow does not stick to a wet road, Sri Ramakrishna used to say. So it has to be a dry road. So if our mind is wet with worldliness, that's how he would probably say it, then all the teachings in the world, like the Dharma drops, raindrops coming from the sky, will not adhere unless you have that Dharma bucket, Buddha said, or if you have this dry road of what he's calling here purity of mind. Now the great seers, they come into life with purity of mind. That's an amazing thing, really. It's something we don't probably look at and examine and contemplate very much. But that's a fundamental fact of a person who isn't troubled by the vicissitudes and vagaries of Maya or by the ocean of suffering called samsara. If they're troubled by it at all, it's just troubled by their compassion for others who are stuck in it. What was our last class series sitting right here some months ago, a few weeks ago before our trip to the mainland for the retreat, was all about Sri Ram's discourse of divine discontent and how he felt so much anguish at seeing people suffer. And these were people who were living in India at the time in an earlier age and had come upon poverty and various problems of the world and diseases of the body and weakness of lack of energy, and all of these things we can complain about today amongst the multitudes of our own cultures in this world. So strength of body is going to be necessary then in order to attain that 4th strata of the will to live a spiritual life. And Vivekananda, of course, will concur with this. If you have read his complete works, or even any parts of them, any of the 4 yogas he put out, or any of the books that have been put out in his name, you can see that he's very much for strength of body, and he'll even go so far and say that you cannot be successful in spiritual life if you don't have strength of a body, if you have weakness. In fact, he went so far at once as to say that weakness is the only real sin, because he had heard people condemning others to be sinners in the religion of the present time here in the West. And they were condemning others to be sinners. He said, that's not, the real sin isn't what you're talking about there. The real sin is weakness, because if you had strength of body and mind, then you would have this will to live a spiritual life, and spiritual life would neutralize your karmas, and it would take away your confusion of mind. A candle in a windless place would be yours every day of your life, and the winds would be shielded, you see, by this force of will. Will isn't the highest thing, Vivekananda was to say, but intelligence is higher. Intelligence is the first compound of consciousness, is how he would say that. Very beautiful statement. So if you were to look at echelons of consciousness, you might say, there's of course basic consciousness, which is just surface, but if you look deeper into levels of consciousness, or higher awareness, sometimes they call this, you'll find out that you'll probably reach some sort of strata called will, a willful intelligence. And then beyond that, maybe when ego becomes more mature, you'll reach a status where everything begins to look to you as made of your own thought, made of your own intelligence. At that point, you'll be seeing through the appearances of Maya and not calling a thing anymore. You're calling that thing a manifestation of Brahman. At about that time, Father of Yoga says, you'll be having samadhi of objects, not just pleasure with them. And after that, then you'll be reaching this idea that everything is Brahman, and there has to be a medium for that. So the first compound of consciousness would be intelligence. And we want to insert another word in there called mother consciousness, mother wisdom, or Shakti if you want to put it in Sanskrit terms. That Shakti power is there in everything, like it is in words. Also it's in objects. And in that way, it's going to take some sort of mechanism, like a human body, because the human bodies, of course, some of them have actually become enlightened before they died. That is, the consciousness in the body had become enlightened when it cast off the form. And it took on another form, and it was still enlightened. And it cast that form off, and took on another form. It was still enlightened. This is what's called fundamental purity of mind. So the mind is producing your bodies, and the parents' nature, seeds, all that are just sort of the means along the way. But it's that intelligence that's predicating everything. And if you can get a hold of that mother intelligence, then of course the will to live a spiritual life will be something already attained. So they're already coming into the whole picture with that higher chit shuddhi. Their thoughts are pure. As you can see, people who are weak or whose bodies are not pure, whose senses are not pure, because I think when he says here human birth and strength of body, you can infer that he means senses, because the senses are a part of the body, and the body a part of the senses. So then you move on to the third strata, and then you can see there the title of this seminar, The Will to Live a Spiritual Life. I put there, as you can see in those arrows, those white arrows, if you want to go beyond that fourth strata and attain 5, 6, 7, and 8, which are comprehension of the scriptures, acquisition of viveka, or discrimination, direct perception of the Atman within you, which I started out chanting this afternoon, and then actual union with Brahman, called samadhi or nirvana or asampragyata or satori, however you want to call it, then you're going to have to increase this will to live a spiritual life after arriving there. Otherwise, you see the other arrow says continuing failure. the common failure of most beings to fall off at that fourth strata, where some get a successful follow-through. So don't get me started as the expression we use about lack of follow-through. I see that so much in the practitioners of today. That's why I had to just go ahead and say it here at the bottom. For the most part, today's Western seekers do not make good disciples. But a few of them might become worthy practitioners. As Swami Vivekananda has stated, quote, "It will take a long time for them to understand true spirituality," unquote. So using him as a background and also his observance as he looked at us here in the West when he arrived on the scene, we see that people in varying stages of trying to acquire this will to live a spiritual life and falling off quite a bit is quite common. I've spoken to several of the Swamis, and sometimes they just have a pat conclusion. No, Westerners are not ready for Vedanta. And so it kind of is painful to hear, whether it be serious or not. I think if we are going to follow through, as we should here, is that we should make ourselves ready for it, or we should try and make others ready for it, which is what SRV Associations has been trying to do for 3 decades now, and which Swamiji came here to help. Even in the midst of this materialism and this ancestor problem that we're up against, the resistance against truth and dharma that's there in our various societal mediums like education, politics, and the problem of violence that keeps going on when we should have gotten over that a long time ago. This constant urge to go to war and to dominate over others, and use the 8 occult powers in their new version and to take the goods of others, and greed and selfishness and so forth. The 3 kushalas in Buddhism that are, if you see that insignia there, is a pig, a rooster, and a snake. Have you ever seen that? That's their emblem for the 3 akushalas. Basically, greed and selfishness and so forth. These are the real problems that shouldn't be there. They're not necessary. So we try and break through those, take some vows, like ahimsa, nonviolence, or satyam, truthfulness, or non-taking of alcohol in Buddhist vows. Things like this are very serious points to consider if you want to have strength of body. Also, I think if you want to keep having human bodies, because in Hinduism and Buddhism there's talk, and in philosophy and in scripture, in the Gita too, for instance, about people being born in other wombs other than human. It's not stretched out and explained so much that way in the Gita, but you can see a strata there of a soul that's moving on towards higher births, to pious people, to people who are wealthy and have time on their hands and are giving their money to spiritual organizations, to people who are yogis, maybe not having children all that much, but if they do, they raise them dharmically, moving on to people who are seriously pursuing a spiritual path in order to get enlightenment. They think about Brahman alone. We'll talk about that at the Renouncing the Householder Who Renounces seminar in 2 weekends. That what is the look of somebody who has successful renunciation? Is they just think about Brahman all the time. They don't have to renounce anything. By thinking about Brahman, everything is Brahman. So how does that happen? And how can that happen for a mature householder like, say, Nag Mahashaya, this amazing householder disciple of Sri Ramakrishna and his wife, who might as well have been monks living in a small hut there, but we're living this pure lifestyle of mature renunciation. We'll look at a lot of that in 2 weekends. So you can see how all of this connects together to have the blessing of a human birth, the blessing of a human birth. It reminds me of Holy Mother saying, fun? The Master and I and our devotees did not come here to have fun. We came here because we know what a boon it is to get a human birth. So there she is saying, as it were, is that if you come to earth, you get a human birth, and you have all this marvelous potential unfolding before you, and you can be of so much help and aid to yourself and to others. And that's Divine Mother saying that. So I think I've said enough about these first three strata. We can look at them using a few charts to clarify it, but you can see there that red line is what we want to reach at some point. We want to check ourselves to make sure that not only this lifetime we have a human body, but let's ensure that this is realized as a temple of the Lord, or as a manifestation of Brahman, and expand our mind's capacity to know that Brahman. So body, senses, brain, mind, intelligence, these are also strata within us that need to be taken up and conquered. We need to gain victory over them. What is the signs of victory, and what's the sign of obstacle? See, obstacles and victory, that's what we want to look at. We'll look at those challenges and obstacles next week. But basically, let's go up here and make sure that we understand the 8 strata of spirituality, and not come up to it and then have a common failure of falling back to just being healthy minds and bodies, living with good food and a little exercise, and not making any spiritual growth in our life. We must have this will to live a spiritual life and reach the goal of human existence. So having just mentioned Holy Mother, let's look at this chart that I brought to attend upon this. And it's one of the great teachings called the 4 fruits of life. Also, there's a similar teaching that I found in our tradition called the 4 boons. So I put them side by side here. So Divine Mother's 4 boons, you could see there, it starts number 1 with a human birth. Manusyatvam is the Sanskrit if you want it. From a human birth, then, you can have holy company. Oh yes, there was the example of Ramana Maharshi's cow. You see some people thinking already in their clever minds, you see, oh well, some animals got some holy company, didn't they? So, whatever the case may be, because a human birth is necessary, we know that human beings have much more affinity with and access to constant company of holy beings. Satsangatve nisangatvam, nisangatve nirmohatvam, nirmohatve nischalitatvam, nischalitatve jivan mukti. See, to get through that strata, to get to a living, liberated state, jivan mukti, then you're going to want to have holy company. Satsangatve. It all starts out that way. I can sing it for you if you want. Satsangatve nisangatvam, so forth. It's called Bhaja Govindam. Adore the Lord, you fool, he says. The very same Shankara who put out the scripture. So he has many of those spiritual tricks up his sleeve to try and convince people to live a spiritual life and to intensify it constantly, so that they can be qualified to attain that peace that passes all understanding. So human birth, it follows that if you had a human birth, like we did, then you'd find holy company somewhere along the way. Like we found like 6 in here in SRV, and we found Swami Shishananda living in the very city that I grew up in without knowing about him until after I left that city. So coming back in my 20s to find him there and getting that direct holy company in this lifetime in my 20s, and other people report similar stories about that. So human birth to holy company, then you get that desire for liberation. That's called mumukshutvam. You'll also find that quality in the sadhana chatushtaya, right? You know what that is. Sadhana, there's that key word which would go hand in hand with the will to live a spiritual life. That is, those four things that you want, which are your sadhana in Vedanta, happen to be viveka vairagya and shatsampati, and then mumukshutvam. So mumukshutvam is coming to a desire to know Brahman, a sincere desire that's uncluttered by anything. That is, throughout life there were some yogis who fell from the goal, Vedavyas says, the father of yoga. They fell from the goal because that's this common failure here that we were looking at, is because then they didn't keep Brahman first and foremost in mind, and they gave up on their strong desire to know Brahman first and foremost. Thou shalt love the Lord thy Father with first and foremost, with thy whole heart, with thy whole mind. These beings, Buddha, Jesus, Shankara, and others, they know because they have clung to that ideal, whereas everyone else clinging to everything unreal. They're clinging to the ideal. So this ideal is first and foremost represented by the highest concept of God the human mind can comprehend in form. That would be Ishvara, or the king of the monkeys, as Vivekananda once said. Oh yeah, it would be like all the monkeys. They all fight with each other and everything, but if they have any argument, they take it in front of the king of monkeys and he settles it right away. So using that funny quip, he's talking about Ishvara settling the affairs of every other being, not just humans. Angels, celestials, demigods, gods, goddesses, asuras, even enlightened beings who fight, like Vashishta and Vishwamitra. If they have any kind of problem between each other, they'll settle it in the highest court. So that being is reached only through this strong desire for freedom, very much in accordance, isn't it, with this will to live a spiritual life and what it can bring you along the way. So that's the third of boons that the Divine Mother of the Universe will grant you if you, well, let's just use Sri Ramakrishna's phrase, if you pray to her with a yearning in your heart and cry tears for her. You can cry even one tear for her. She'll feel that. She'll know that. So this is where knowing and loving and meditating and serving all come together as four yogas to help one attain that. And that's why you'll get a pure mind that eventually will come back as fundamental purity of mind. When you are young again in a new body and you remember or forget, but in this case you remember that you are the devotee of the Divine Mother of the Universe, and you always have been. But at birth it was covered. She covers herself. That's the covering power of Maya that's at work in everyone, even in the avatars in the beginning. So there's a covering power there that you're going to have to, like green scum on a lake, just part. And what's the hand that's parting it? What is that called? The will to live a spiritual life. And I must do it again and again until I get that pure vision of Mother in myself, as myself. O meditator, you see, as Ramprasad says, very beautiful, meditate upon the Mother. She is your very essence. So when that comes clear, then you've got that pure mind, which they covet most highly. You see the Sanskrit for their chit, which is the thoughts, shuddhi, which is pure. Their thoughts are always pure. Let's then go on and look at the four fruits from which we're taking this hint. The human body. So the four fruits then are dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. You can see on either side of Divine Mother there the image of her. Spiritual life is a good way of just describing dharma. And right livelihood would be artam. That's also one of the eightfold path of Lord Buddha, right livelihood. And then legitimate desire, kama. We put the word legitimate there because desires which are impure, of course, are causing falls in people. So we want to have that, make sure that that desire is not in in any kind of competition with this dharma. So dharma has to be taken first for artha and kama to be pure. Otherwise, if you go after money and you go after trying to satisfy desires, which all people are trying to do here on earth, and the dharma isn't there to check you, then there will come these problems. So it's must not be must not be contrary to the ordinances of the scriptures. It must not be contrary to the dharma teachings that you've been given. So that's a check for all of these four fruits, and it will end in moksha. And that's also what even Shankara sings, not just teaches you in the Vivekachidama bit. He'll sing it for you. Name dvesha raga, name lobha moha, mado naiva me naiva, matsarya bhavaha. Na dharmo na charto, na kamo na moksha, chidananda rupa, shivoham, shivoham, chidananda rupa, Shivoham, Shivoham. So he sings, and with Vivekananda's translation of that third verse of the 6 verses on Nirvana, called Nirvana Shatkam, neither loathing nor liking have I. Name dvesha, name lobha. Neither greed nor delusion have I, like matsarya, jealousy and delusion. No sense of I or ego of pride have I. Neither dharma nor moksha, neither desires of the mind nor object for its desiring. For I am pure consciousness and bliss. I am Shiva. I am Shiva. So he's singing about something that dawns upon the aspiring mind when moksha is gained. Then he's taken dharma and checked out his life of right livelihood and legitimate desire, and he's attained moksha. And these are all being given to him by who? These are the boons of the Divine Mother path. So you can see that although he's an Advaitist, although he's a monk, although he's a Shaivite worshipper of Shiva, which he sings at the end, he knows the role and the power of the Divine Mother of the Universe. He wrote hymns to her. And he's always bringing her up in the context of those who want to receive this boon of 4 fruits of life and how to proceed on the Mother path. Whether they're going to become monks and sannyasins, or whether they're going to become fully renounced householders, which we'll talk about in 2 weeks, or whether there will be righteous merchants, or whether there will be self-sacrificing workers, any of the 4 castes that were there in India all this time. Many of these beings who knew the Dharma knew about putting it first and then going on to artha and kama. And at the end, Mother would accept your worship of a lifetime well spent in that kind of purity of mind, and she would grant you moksha. She would grant you liberation. Whether that liberation is jivan or videha, that's what we talked about a lot recently in our retreat last week. Whether it's disembodied liberation or whether it's come again, let's see, goodbye, goodbye, and thanks for all the teachings, or whether it's I'm coming back to spread these teachings to others. So that's a quick study, and there's a chart we can take from Holy Mother. A quote. An impure mind does not easily become pure. Well, that's sobering right there. But remember, the mind is everything. You will have to carry the mind with you when you try and realize Brahman. So at the present stage, the mind is very important. It is the pure mind that shows man the way. One fulfills all desires in this life and reaches liberation when the mind becomes steady. Steady like a candle in a windless place, steady like somebody who has reached success in the will to live a spiritual life and is swiftly moving on to studying the scriptures and acquiring viveka khyati or viveka jnana. You say that in either Buddhism or Hinduism or Vedanta, then you can see how important all these are. So each one of these sentences really is worth commentary. The mind is everything just really says that everything is a projection of the mind via the power of vibration. And if the mind is geared towards Brahman or the word of Brahman, then of course it can always return involution style to its source. But if it's forgotten about that and it's gone in the outward mind, senses, objects trajectory, then it's at risk and it needs to pull itself back. So this is why she said an impure mind does not easily become pure. See? So she's giving us cautionary teachings, she's telling us the philosophy, and she's telling us that a pure mind is the way. 3 things of great power and import in just one little saying of the Divine Mother of the Universe. If you know how to unwrap her sayings or just listen to them, then you know the power of words and how the instruction for your entire spiritual life is in one utterance of hers. One utterance. And I didn't even bring up this point, which is very important, is that you'll have to carry the mind with you and you realize Brahman. People are trying to do away with the mind. See? You have to carry it with you as a whole other thing. You have to use it as a vehicle. It's like your sailing ship to get to Brahman. People think they can just get to Brahman by swimming the ocean without a ship. That's a long swim. And so there are people there who are, we're calling them pseudo-advaitists these days, which they think that they can just meditate beyond the mind and go there. Yes, meditate beyond the ordinary mind, but when you find the intelligence of your mind, all the wisdom that's there, and you find her presence there, you'll dedicate your mind to her, and that mind will take you to Brahman. That's your vehicle. And this is, of course, point of fact. So this is, again, an easy study, but this puts an exclamation point upon these 4 boons and these 4 fruits. Let's move on, as our time in these classes is not ample. Every once in a while I like to put up a view of yoga. So here we have across the board from a human birth the 4 yamas and the 5 yamas and the 5 niyamas, right? Should pretty much say something that all my students know about, because I've shared with them the Vedanta and its depths, but I've also side by side put together teachings on the 8-limbed yoga, especially as it is much more profound and deeper than just the kind of yoga that's being peddled out there today, sold to people. But it's again a yoga of the mind we're talking about here, Raja Yoga, Mano Yoga. It's not just a body yoga. So we've been saying this for many, many years and decades, and I think people are beginning to pick up on it. So if you put it right across the board, and let me leave this chart for now, it's going to be difficult for you to see both of these on one screen, but and I'm not going to go through them thoroughly, but let's take the 5 yamas and 5 niyamas. But first let's take this 8-limbed tree of yoga. so we can see what yoga is. There's the 5 yamas and niyamas. So this is put straight across the board, you see, from human birth. A human birth, you should come into the picture with nonviolent. In India, they would, if you weren't nonviolent, they'd quickly teach you how to be nonviolent. The Jains, the Buddhists, the Hindus, and other darshanas or routes in life. And I think basically all the religions, even at the conventional level, they hold some sort of an idea about not being violent to each other, not murdering, not killing. They're in the commandments. A commandment like thou shalt not kill isn't all that much different than a yama like ahimsa, which means you don't commit violence to any being. Except with ahimsa, of course, it's accompanied with the knowledge that it's not possible to kill or be killed because the Atman's unborn. I could sing you another verse of the Nirvana Shatkam about that. Namrichor Nashanka, Name Jati Beda. I have no death because I was never born. It's catches you off guard. I have no death. You're talking to someone like Shankara and says, well, when you die, what's going to happen? I have no death because I was never born. So it's like saying, you're looking at a body here, but you're not seeing the soul behind it, isn't it? You're not seeing that undying principle. You're used to seeing things that die, that come and that go. You're used to appearances, but you've never gotten used to seeing the one unchanging, the soul with a capital S, the Atman, Buddha nature, Tathagata Garbha. Busho. You've never gotten used to seeing that one unchanging and knowing that to be the reality and everything else just a covering. So let's start you off with yamas and niyamas. So ahimsa will be the first thing you'll want to know about practices in yoga. Followed quickly by make sure that you don't do harm, ahimsa, by false words. People are always and ever telling you what you want to hear. This is something you should probably wake up and realize. They're always telling you what you want to hear, but they're never telling you the truth. And it's almost down to the person that this is happening. Sure, they want you to know, they want you to feel good about yourself and about them. So it's this facade people are putting all the time. But you have to be very specific when you practice satyam and follow it. Truth of your words. An elephant's tusk go out, Shankaracharya said, but they should never turn and go back in. Then you've got a berserker, a mad elephant. That happens because the tusk has grown back into the elephant's jawbone and is continuing to grow and penetrate. That's very painful. But one day this elephant can't stand it, and he runs through the village grabbing little Hindu men and tossing them over trees. So that's what Sri Ramakrishna means about that, is a man's words should go out, but they should carry only truth. And if they don't, the words come back to him and they were false, then that's like a tusk growing back in to an elephant's jaw. So satyam has to be practiced to the letter of the law, in every detail. And then you'll be an example for others, and maybe they'll know that they can't pull the wool over your eyes anymore, and that their words will come back at them in an untoward way at some point, and they'll have to reconsider how they deal with you. So nonviolence and satyam go together in that way. There are other ways in which they exist on their own, but that's a good connection way. Then you have asteya, do not covet the goods of others. It's right there in the Upanishad, Ishavasya Upanishad, within the first few slokas. You should know, O students, you should not covet the goods of others. And that pertains not just to individuals, but to countries, of course. So if the individual practices asteya and maintains it, and you get a bunch of individuals together and they maintain it, then governments won't be able to come and dissuade them otherwise. persuade them otherwise. They won't be able to dissuade them from this vow they've taken not to steal from others, not to take what's not theirs. Every kid gets his hand slapped for doing that. In the old days, you got it cut off for doing that, even in Europe. So we're not talking just East and West, how different it is. We're talking about people who, because they're violent and because they're not telling the truth, they'll go on and begin to take the goods of others. Even tell them, oh, this is for your own good that we're taking these goods from you. See? Does it remind you of the rooster, the snake, and the pig, all of a sudden? That Buddhist emblem of greed and selfishness and violence. Brahmacharya, then, moderation for the householder, celibacy for the monk. Aparigraha, do not take and give with any kind of motive behind it. You need to be able to refuse things in a polite way, and you need to be able to give things at the right moment if you're a householder. So this is how a householder would practice renunciation, around giving and receiving. And they were very specific about this in old India. They're very careful about how to give a gift at the right place at the right time. That's called sattvic giving, and Krishna outlines it in the Gita as compared to, say, tamasic giving, where you'll give someone a gift just to make them angry or to mislead them. So those are yamas. Remember, we're coming off of this chart that says, across the board from a human body, if you want to put the 8 strata side by side with Patanjali's 8-limb yoga, because there are 8 things in each one of those, that's an interesting comparison. We're doing it right now. As far as the niyamas, then, tapas, I chanted today, Om Satyena, that's right there. Labhyas tapasa, that's right there. So these chants of the Upanishads, they're using these all the time. Satyena labhyas tapasa, hyesa atma, samyak jnanena, that's right there. Svadhyaya. Samyak jnanena, brahmacharyena, right there. Nityam. All of these things constantly cultivated will remove the impurities from that otherwise impure mind that you came into the picture with, and you'll not have to suffer that anymore. So this is the beauty of yoga, it's the beauty of Vedanta, and the beauty of putting the two together is most beautiful of all. So yes, there it is. Tapas, do some austerity. Svadhyaya, do your study and memorization of scriptures, which I talked about at the beginning of this class. Have devotion to Ishvara. I've already talked about that just a few minutes ago, how to go there to the Lord of the universe, to the Mother of the universe, and offer everything at their feet, and let them guide the process, and then go about your way and reach the highest goal of perfection in this very lifetime. And santosha, be peaceful and gentle. And saucha, purity. Try for purity of mind. So you can see how these 5 yamas and niyamas then are in direct accord with this strata that Shankara is talking about. Quickly, because like I said, I like to show these two every once in a while in a class together. You can see the rest of the limb of yoga. The tree of yoga. So there's one limb. There's the second limb. Each limbs are 5-fold, right? This is a 101 course in yoga for those of you who don't already know it, but it's also a review for those of you who maybe have forgotten how important it is to keep thinking on it every day and to connect them. Third limb would then be right up there with asana, you see, right here, posture and breathing. So asana and pranayama are 3rd and 4th limbs of yoga. In Vedanta, you start here, breathing. That's called Sadanga Yoga. We've been studying that in the Amrita Nada Upanishad, in Portland. We'll finish that up in September. We've finally come to the end of that study of that Upanishad, which talks about Sadanga Yoga. Sadanga Yoga Natu Naiva Shudam. Mana Vinasha Natu Naiva Shudam. Guru Padesha Natu Naiva Shudam. He says, so the self cannot be made pure by these 6 limbs of yoga. The self cannot be made pure by bowing at the Guru's feet. The self cannot be made pure by mano vinasham, destroying the mind's waves, like in some fanciful meditation where you roll your eyes up and stick your tongue out and think you're enlightened. The self cannot be made pure by that, because the self is already pure. So people who are talking about Advaita Vedanta and purification of the self, realization of the self, don't know that it has to be, the Atman has to be realized before you are that. You can't just say, I am Atman. You have to realize the Atman first. You cannot say, I am Brahman, until you realize Brahman. And that realization comes about through practice. After you get a will to live a spiritual life and follow it through to the end. Follow through. We'll look more at that later. There you see, then posture and breathing becomes important. Having a straight back, sitting up, filling your lungs with air. If you want, do some breathing exercise that opens the nadis, not only the physical ones, but the nadis in the psychic. Let the psychic prana flow into your mind, so your brain doesn't just get more oxygen, but your mind gets more wisdom. Wisdom is the oxygen of the mind, which is like oxygen is to the brain. So you want to breathe that wisdom in all the time. That's why you practice swadhyaya. That's why you did austerities. And that's why you had a devotion to truth. And you practice storing up energy, brahmacharya. All these things you did because you wanted this mind to expand in its capacity to know Brahman. Capaciousness, a nice word in English. Then, and this is a quick run through the 8 limbs of yoga because it's been brought up here. Self-control is called pratyahara, and talk about falling back. And just like in this chart we were looking at, there's a falling back from trying to live a will to live a spiritual life. If you don't follow through, here's the falling back and no follow through in the 8 limbs of yoga. They reach posture, breathing, and maybe some good moral and ethical practices. But when they find out that they have to strip the mind of all it desires, many of those desires being not legitimate, right? 4 fruits of life, that you have to have dharma first, and dharma is demanding that you do this, but you're not doing this. And when that happens, pratyahara becomes a very hard limb to surmount. It's slippery for most people. All these limbs had less moss on them. But when you got up to the 5th limb, you're like trying to grasp for sense control, self-control, and moderation should have helped you, you see, to attain that. But if your muscles weren't still strong enough because you didn't have strength of body yet and strength of mind, purity of mind, then come tumbling back down from the 5th limb of yoga, and you become a professional asana doer or something. Well, I think I'll just go and teach people how to twist their bodies into pretzel shapes and huff and puff their lungs like a bellows. But Shankara said in his scriptures, you can do thousands of asanas and breathing exercises, but that'll never get you enlightenment. Right there in this very same scripture that we're looking into right now. So the will to live a spiritual life is going to have to be based on what Holy Mother just told us is the working and purifying of this mind. That's the boat that's going to take you to Brahman. If it's leaky, if it's got holes in its sails, if its timbers are weak, how far can it take you before you come tumbling back down? Whether it's back down off of the 8-fold strata, or whether it's tumbling off the tree of yoga in the 8 limbs. If you can follow through, then in yoga you've got 6, 7, and 8. Dharana, Dhyan, and Samadhi. put those all together, you've got what they call samyama. You put samyama on anything, you get the fruit of it. You can get the essence of anything if you put together 6th, 7th, and 8th limbs of yoga. So that's, of course, concentration, which almost does it. If you can concentrate on anything, particularly spiritual life, but anything, then you're almost a success already. And you won't come falling off of any tree or sliding off of any strata. Concentration will hold you. That's a candle in a windowless place, concentration you're talking about. The thing about it is that when you attain it, you like it. It's like you've reached some plateau which is entirely non-ordinary, and there's nothing to compare to it when you look back. I don't see anything that equals this feeling I have when self-control has led to concentration, and I'm full master of myself now. My consciousness is not full of waves anymore, but it's all settled down like an ocean, a windless ocean, always sunlit. That's what the feeling of true dharana is like, concentration. And there you see meditation absorption. I went ahead and fleshed out all these upper limbs with their various Sanskrit components. Asana, Pranayama, Pratyahara, Dharana, Dhyan, Samadhi. But off the right side of the chart, you can see Samadhi, according to Father of Yoga, has 4 seated samadhis there. Savitarka, Savichara, Sananda, and Sasmita. Basically, don't have time to go into a retreat to teach all those right now, but we've done it before. But it really starts off with realizing having balance with objects, and then having balance with no objects. They want you to put that together. Balance with no objects, balance with objects. So you have to balance yourself out here. Talk about renunciation is deification, not condemnation. So for the householder, they're going to have to look at objects in a whole new way. Not just inanimate objects, but bodies of children and relatives and old folks and so forth. They're going to have to start having a new relationship with objects that isn't based on fear or pleasure. Go beyond them both, sannyas both. That is the fear of pain and the search for pleasure. Go beyond them both. So that's where savitarka, savicharka, nirvitarka, savichara, and nirvichara come in. Basically in the lower yogas called seated yogas. And then you go on towards the unseated yoga. Well, that's over here. So we looked at that, and I think that's actually enough to look at. We want to, if we wanted to look at all the roots, then you'd see what, and you can look at this in the Footfalls book, you can see what the Father of Yoga says about each one of these yamas and niyamas. And let's just see, for instance, what Patanjali himself says about them. At the most auspicious time, the transmission of yoga will be given according to the tradition. In essence, yoga is that singular state wherein all mental thoughts and vibrations have been dissolved. In effect, yoga consists of perceiving the distinction between nature and consciousness, allowing the seer to rest in his own true nature. Who said that again? Patanjali. Who is Patanjali? The father of yoga. The father of which yoga? The 8-limbed yoga, the kingly yoga, Raja Yoga, the yoga of Samadhi, the Ashtanga Yoga. So we have this great expert who has been incarnated several times, most recently brought forth in about 140 AD, they say, this yoga of 8-limbed variety. He was able to compose it and pull it together into these 8 facets. The father of Vedanta, looking at his system and marveling later on, said, primarily yoga is samadhi. So here's the Vedantist looking at the great yogis. I'm sorry, I'm always on the wrong chart here. The great yogis assessment of these upper limbs of samadhi. The Vedantists would probably look at this chart and say, yeah, that's right, it looks good, that's great. There's where I want to go. And he's up there at the 8th limb looking at these various yogas. Wow, that's marvelous. And then I think I'll say this about him. The primary yoga is samadhi. That's what I'm getting from Patanjali. If I'm the father of Vedanta and I look at yogic system, that's what I'm getting from his system. Its secondary directive is to bring control to mental modifications. Beautiful. So primarily you know that yoga is samadhi. It's not a practice. It is that ultimate reality. Its secondary direction is control of the mind, its thoughts, the chitta-vrittis. This it accomplishes by the dissolution of all vrittis. Mind's true nature is illumination. Now we're starting to hear Gaudapada come through. You see, the Advaita Vedanta. These beings all lived relatively near to each other in time and incarnated with each other too. So mind's true nature is illumination. That's definitely heading toward the Advaita now of Gaudapada. That same mind turns wayward due to rajas. So then he gives you the reason for the mind's fall. Up to then, it was all beautiful. Here, I've got it, as Ram says, I've got a cherry stone stuck in my throat all of a sudden. So you remember that in our teachings? I just heard about my fall from yoga is due to this restlessness. Does it sound familiar, folks, everywhere in today's day and age, particularly in the West? Mind's fall from samadhi is due to, would never happen if I kept my mind under control, all its modifications. But since I have not, restlessness has come along and taken away my balance. When tinged with tamas, it turns dark. Samadhi is regained through that intelligence that discerns that fine distinction between sattvic balance and the conscious principle. Back to what Patanjali just said, right? He said, well, my system is really just about separating consciousness from matter. Isn't that what he just said? So you can see how the father of Vedanta looks at the yoga system previous to him. I don't know, they don't know, but some several hundred years maybe, examines it, comes to the same conclusions with his own order, the way he sees it being put forth, a great seer like Vedavyas, and comes right down to the final conclusion, which is just right back to this need to practice discrimination between the real and the unreal. Separate the wheat from the chaff, and then live in peace and bliss your entire life. I think today's class, although only an hour and a half, has been able to acquaint us fairly well with these first two strata of Shankara's system. Again, if you look in Footfalls, you'll, I think this is in Footfalls, certainly it's on the cover of Footfalls, but the image. But if you look there, the will to live a spiritual life, which also can be read about in this article that has just appeared in Prabhupada Bharata, you'll be able to ruminate. That's Swadhyaya, right? You'll be able to ruminate on this 8 strata that Shankara thinks is so important, but that 4th level, it's sort of like the 5th limb of yoga over here in Patanjali. If you can get to Pratyahara, you're probably not going to fall back off that. If you can master Pratyahara, control the mind. In the same way, Shankara, across the board from the 8 limb system, because he also did commentary on Gita and these great systems, his idea is that if I put it into an 8-fold strata, that if you gain the will to live a spiritual life, you will not fall back to a weak body or a human birth or a subhuman birth even is possible again. And you'll come back with this essential purity of mind, with all of these things learned and gained, and no need to repeat them. You can maintain that at a very high level of practice, which is yoga as samadhi. it won't take you very much time at all just to remember yourself. And we know Shankara did that when he was 8 years old. I mean, that's kind of a record from everything that we know about human history, that the quickest person to remember the Atman, and I don't know that they have a competition about it, but from what we've heard, this Shankara was already in know and retrieving all the scriptural study that he had done in previous lifetimes when he was 6, and 8 had remembered it all, because Vedavyas, remember, had written it down at an earlier age for us, all the Upanishads, out of his mind, had written it down, so that he captured many of the Upanishads for us to study today. So that's what kind of mind they have. I've often said my teacher had the whole Gita memorized in his 90s and would recite it to us. Swami Sheshanandaji Maharaj, peace and bliss be among him. I was there listening to that many times at his ashram. So I sought the proof of that the mind can be so capacious as to remember all the teachings from a previous birth, bring them forward into this lifetime, and teach others a system like intensifying their spiritual life, so that they can open up this vista of divine vision that is to come. In his case, the acquisition of knowledge of the scriptures, the viveka khyati or viveka dhyan, the discrimination that filters out all the wheat from the chaff and the chaff from the wheat, and then divine perception of one's Atman, the divine self within, which is gained by satyena labhishtapasa hyesa atma samya gnana brahmacharyena nipsham, all of these things that the Upanishads and yoga concur about, and finally reach this beautiful union with Brahman, which yoga already is. See? And look back at that tree and say, well, you know, I'm always at the upper branches, but thanks for the tree. Om Bhadram Karnebihi Sriniyama Devaha Bhadram Pashyema Akshibirya Jatraha Stirayangayesh Tushuvasas Tanavir Vishema Devahitam Yadayuhu. May we see with these eyes what is good and spiritual, hear with these ears what is noble and uplifting. And may we, while worshipping the Lord and Mother with healthy minds and bodies, live a life which is beneficial to ourselves and to all others. Om, peace, peace, peace. May peace be unto us, may peace be unto all. Om Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om Tat Sat.